She's been compared to the beauty and the statue of Venus, and the perfection of Galatea in the myth Pygmalion and Galatea, with the beguiling smile of Mona Lisa, who holds the mystery of the ages. In this episode, I'll be discussing what the bust of Nefertiti is and why it led to her enduring memory. I'll give histories from her life and the bust itself, moving into the controversies that surround it, whether it's real or fake, even 100-year-old fake, and the repatriating of stolen artifacts. Continuing, I will discuss briefly the change in art style of the Amarna period and the whitening up of her features. Lastly, I will discuss the art itself, the material, hence the real versus fake arguments, and the color pigments, the headdress, the makeup, and the necklace. Whether the bust in the Berlin Museum is real, or something whipped up by European archaeologists to make their finds more substantial, which is a bad thing, to be clear. There is still much we can learn about the history of archaeology from a 100-year-old fake, and much we can learn about art history in both the ancient and more modern contexts. But I'd like to go into this assuming that it's real. Hello everyone, my name is Renee. Welcome to the 13th episode of Detours in Archaeology. This is Bust of a Beautiful Woman. As I alluded to in my first episode on Black Panther 2, the Queen's profile on her coffin lid was extraordinarily reminiscent of the very famous Queen Nefertiti, and that bust is what I'll be discussing. But what's in a name? Growing up, I was often told that the names Nefertiti and Nefertari were different names for the same queen. This, people, was a lie. For some reason, people don't distinguish queens with different names, and yet they remember different kings with the same name. Without getting too bogged down with the failings of the American education system, these two queens lived at least 50 years apart and in different dynasties. Nefertiti in the 18th and Nefertari, which means beautiful companion, in the 19th, being the first of the great royal wives or principal wives of Ramses the Great. Now, Nefertiti did have different names depending on the time period. Let me explain. Nefer meant beautiful or peaceful. Titi meant walking. And together, the name can be translated as the beautiful woman has come. While the modern Egyptological pronunciation renders her name as Nefertiti, her name could have been pronounced as Nefertiti at the time, since we do not know vowels. Along with her name, she had many titles based on descriptions and labels given on cartouches from the period. These include, but are not limited to, Hereditary Princess, Great of Praises, Lady of Grace, Sweet of Love, Lady of the Two Lands, Main King's Wife, His Beloved, Great King's Wife, His Beloved, Lady of All Women, and Mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt. Nefer-Nefer-Nu-Aten was the name of the first of two pharaohs in the murky timeline between the end of Akhenaten's reign and the reign of King Tutankhaten or Tutankhamun, King Tut. Although the identity and even the gender of the ruler as a definitive fact is unclear, it is most likely, based on the name of the remaining cartouches, that it would have been Nefertiti. There are several different theories and a lot of disagreement into who this person was, but what is salient is that Nefer-Nefer-Nu-Aten's successor seems to have denied them a king's burial, which could also be why archaeologists haven't found Nefertiti's tomb. Later, in the reign of Horemheb, the entire Amarna period began to be regarded as an offense to Egypt itself, causing the kingly reigns of the Amarna period pharaohs from Akhenaten to Ai to be expunged from history, and all the king's total regnal years were assigned to Horemheb. The result is that over 3,300 years later, scholars have to piece together events and resurrect the players bit by bit with the evidence, sometimes limited to the palimpsests, which is a manuscript page either from a scroll or a book, from which the text has been scraped or washed off in preparation for reuse. For a very brief summary of her life history, Nefertiti was estimated to have lived between circa 1370 and 1330 BCE. Nefertiti was the last queen of the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt and the great royal wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Nefertiti and her husband were known for the religious revolution in which they switched to monotheism, worshipping one god only, the Aten, or the sun disk. Beside her husband, she reigned at what was arguably the wealthiest period of ancient Egyptian history. If Nefertiti did rule as pharaoh, her reign was marked in the end by the fall of Amarna and the move of the capital back to the city of Thebes. Her parentage is not well known with certainty, but one often cited theory is that she was the daughter of Ai, who would later get to be pharaoh. One major problem of this theory is that neither Ai or his wife Te were actually called the father and mother of Nefertiti in existing sources, and Te's only recorded connection with Nefertiti was that she was the nurse of the great queen Nefertiti, which would have been an unlikely title for a queen's mother. So it is considered likely that due to the great influence he wielded during Nefertiti's time and continued to wield after her death. However, no sources exist that directly contradict Ai's fatherhood, so it is considered likely due to great influence that he wielded during Nefertiti's time and continued to wield after her death. According to another theory, which attempts to explain how Ai could be Nefertiti's father with his wife not being her mother, not like he couldn't have married before, or just as easily had a child with another woman. Nefertiti was thought to be the daughter of Ai and Iwi, but her mother died before her rise to the position of queen, whereupon Ai married Te, making her Nefertiti's stepmother. But this is entirely based on speculation and conjecture. For a briefer summary of the bust history, it was reportedly found on the 6th of December 1912 in Amarna by the German Oriental Company, or DOG, by German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt. A 1924 document found in the archives of the DOG mentions a January 20th, 1913 meeting between Borchardt and a senior Egyptian official to discuss the division of the archaeological finds of 1912 between Germany and Egypt. The secretary of the DOG, who was the author of the document and was present at the meeting, wrote that Borchardt, quote, wanted to save the bust for us, unquote. Borchardt is suspected of having concealed the bust's real value, although obviously he denied doing so. The bust found has been theorized to actually been a sculptor's modello, which was used for modeling more busts, and would be a piece used for study and practice, and would also be used as a basis for other official portraits, and kept in the artist Thutmose's workshop, along with other unfinished busts of Nefertiti. Dietrich Wüldung also proposed that the bust in Berlin was a model for official portraits, used by the master sculptor to teach his students how to carve the internal structure of the eye, and thus the left iris was not added. Helen Gardner's 1926 art history textbook, Gardner's Art Through the Ages, and Silverman presents a similar view that the bust was deliberately kept unfinished. As an aside, the only version of the 3D artifact that I've ever seen in person was a copy in the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum in San Jose in the Amarna section. I would always tell everyone on tours that it was a copy of the one in the Berlin Museum, which in itself was not meant to be a fancy bust or even a complete bust per se, as it wasn't for decoration. But it was a cheaper version so the artist could paint portraits and craft the intricate busts and statues without her having to constantly pose for them. In the 18th dynasty, while Nefertiti was queen, the culture of the religious, governmental, and artistic parts of the Egyptian world shifted, bringing about the monotheistic worship of the Aten, the sun disk, took power away from the old temples and moved the capital to Tel El Amarna, where the bust was found, and began building lives and homes in an open way, with many more windows, open roof styles, and the house itself was being surrounded by gardens. Nature was being brought to the people. According to Egyptologist David Silverman, The bust reflects the classical Egyptian art style, deviating from the eccentricities of the Amarna art style, which was developed in Akhenaten's reign. The old artistic style of sharpness and deliberate perfection to details is reflected in the sharpness of Nefertiti's features. This was, however, also mixed with the natural beauty of the Amarna style, as an almost caricature-ish style. There are many pieces of art depicting Nefertiti, her husband, and their children worshipping the Aten on the limestone reliefs. They make offerings, holding up their hands in worship, and the sun disk has the lines coming down with hands holding ankhs. This was symbolic of the Aten giving life to the world, because the sun provides heat, warmth, and growth for plants. In one of these reliefs, Nefertiti is making offerings to the Aten. The hieroglyphs say Nipti Tawi. She is named as female lord of the two lands and Kardush, or lordess of the two lands Nefertiti, which is on display at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Discussing the facial shape, it was likely influenced by the Amarna style of the time. Nefertiti's bust had a purposely manipulated shape. Just like her husband's sculptures, the composite of the male and female genders could have been common due to the compilation of the Aten, who was believed to be both male and female at the same time. This is why there have been several papers looking at the gender around Nefertiti and what's depicted in her bust. Even Egyptologist Hawass said that the new style seen in the bust is part of the changes introduced by Akhenaten. According to Arnold, Green, and Allen, Nefertiti appearing as a sculptural double of Akhenaten is paralleled most closely in the facial resemblances of kings or queens to deities. Art of all periods are endowed with the facial features of the ruling king or queen as a way of expressing the Egyptian belief that the pharaoh was the representative of God on earth. As it was colored, the queens could supposedly be paler, living inside more commonly not working, but that doesn't remove the darker skin pigmentation of melanin. Even when the Nubian royal family did have children with the royal Egyptians, who may have had slightly fairer skin, they would not have been white. Just getting that out there. Much of the same time, statues of pharaohs and their queens would have been painted red, just like the statues of gods, identifying them as greater. While the paint may have faded to a point, the red shouldn't have been completely lightened, like in examples that are found in many European museums. As a description of the bust's artistic aspects, the bust is approximately 48 centimeters tall, 19 inches, and weighs about 20 kilograms, or 44 pounds. It is made of a limestone core and covered with painted stucco layers. The face is symmetrical and mostly intact, except for the left eye that lacks the inlay present in the right. We already discussed how that might have been for training purposes. The pupil of the right eye is of inserted quartz with black paint and is fixed with beeswax. The background of the eye socket is unadorned limestone. The pigments were analyzed when Poyat commissioned a chemical analysis of the colored pigments on the head. The result of the examination was published in the book Portrait of Queen Nefertiti in 1923. The blue on her crown was a powdered frit colored with copper oxide. The skin color, as a light red, was fine powdered lime spar colored with red chalk, iron oxide. The yellow was orpiment, or arsenic sulfide. The green was powdered frit colored with copper and iron oxide. Black was coal with wax as a binding medium, and the white was chalk. By examining these colors on the modello, archaeologists were first able to tell that the pigments were made and painted by the ancient Egyptian methods. But more recently, with the CT scanning technology in 1992 and then in 2006, researchers saw cross-sections of the bust every 5 millimeters, 0.20 inches. In 2006, the director of Berlin's Egyptian Museum observed wrinkles on Nefertiti's neck and bags under her eyes while trying a different lighting at the Alts Museum where the bust was displayed at the time. This suggested to the director that the sculptor had tried to depict signs of aging, and that the CT scan confirmed Veldig's findings. The sculptor, Tutmos, had added gypsum under the cheeks and eyes in an attempt to perfect and add more detail to his sculpture. The scan also revealed that Tutmos placed layers of varying thickness on top of the limestone core. The inner face has creases around her mouth and cheeks and swelling on the nose. The creases and the bump on the nose are leveled by the outermost stucco layer. According to Huppertz, director of the Imaging Science Institute in Berlin, this may reflect the aesthetic ideals of the era. The 2006 scan, of course, provided greater detail than the 1992. It revealed subtle details just 1 to 2 millimeters under the stucco. The same 2006 CT scan showed the wrinkles of the face of Nefertiti was carved into the inner core of the bust. These results, however, weren't published until the April 2009 issue of Radiology. Nefertiti is wearing her characteristic Egyptian blue crown known as the Nefertiti cap crown, complete with a golden diadem band looped around it, appearing like horizontal ribbons that join to the back. Complete with the golden diadem band looped around it, which appear like horizontal multicolored horizontal ribbons that join at the back. In the front, a uraeus cobra, which had broken off long ago, would have shown a coiled cobra symbolizing Wadjet, or how people normally say it, Wadjet, or the green one. The cobra snake goddess is matron and protector of the pharaoh, women in childbirth, and at first only lower, but after the unification of the two ancient sides of the Upper and Lower Kingdoms, but after the unification of the ancient two sides of Upper and Lower Egypt, all of Egypt. While many of the statues found lack the vibrant blue color of the bust, Egyptian blue was found on artworks in the 1890s before repainting was common. Other than Nefertiti and her daughters, only kings would wear the cap crown, and outside the Amarna period, it's found that most, if not all, were yellow. But the reason for the changes is not understood. Since it only shows up in one representation from the Old Kingdom, by Pepi II as a child, and then in the 12th dynasty, it was likely brought back in the Amarna period, the 18th, and then, skipping many more years, brought back again in the 20th dynasty. The significance of these crowns, even without the blue coloring, is that they were believed to signify a child of a priest or of a god, and thus Nefertiti was seen as equal to the pharaoh. This begs the question as to why the bust or modello itself wasn't painted more red, as again, that would have been used to identify royalty as deities. But maybe it was, and it just faded over time, and was possibly repainted. While it is reminiscent in the style and shape of the capreche, the rounder crown worn by Akhenaten, the cap crown is taller and flat, and is thought to also be shaped to the head or the hair. This could possibly be demonstrating childhood skull binding, making the skull longer to follow specific beauty standards. Since we haven't found Nefertiti's mummy yet, it's hard to prove this, though it has been a demonstrated practice found in mummies of other rulers. The modello itself does not appear to be wearing much in the way of makeup. Likely over the centuries the paint pigments would have faded, though not as totally as the paint of the Greek marble statues. Of course, it does help to have been hidden in a sheltered area out of the elements. But both males and females of all stations would have worn at least some makeup. It was both a religious adornment and practical in the arid Egyptian climate. But unfortunately, some of the materials they used were not very healthy for the body, like lead. Kohl, which was used as a thick black eyeliner, could be made out of various materials, including carbon black, so coal or soot, iron oxide, galena, which is lead sulfide, or stibnite, antimony sulfide. After mixing the powder substances with saliva, resin, or some other liquid, if available, it acted like today's eyeliner and mascara, and the cheek lines on ball players, which help keep the sun out of the eyes of the wearers. Of course, very useful in the desert of ancient Egypt. In addition, its stickiness could also keep bugs from crawling into the eyes. While the first two base ingredients were harmless, sometimes lead and other toxic materials would be added to the ingredient list to prevent outside bacteria and other biological material from spreading their hazards into the body. Although this was seen as having great benefits, especially for babies and children, in which case it was said to prevent bad eye and improve eye health, it did come with problems of its own. The poison seeped through the skin and entered the bloodstream, poisoning the body, affecting the brain, the nervous and reproductive systems, and more. But the gods wore it, so the lining of the eyes was seen as extremely culturally and ritualistically significant. What wasn't included in the bust was neither the malachite powder, a green mineral used for eyeshadow, nor the red ochre that was used in lip coloring. The collar necklace, as a depiction of royal jewelry, is and was used as a personal decoration and a status symbol. The stones used included blue Egyptian faience, which is a baked quartz ceramic material with a siliceous body and brightly colored glaze. In addition to silica, faience also contains alkaline salts, the source of which was either natron or plant ash, minor amounts of lime, and a metallic colorant. It turns light blue or a bright blue-green when it is fired, and placed next to the red, yellow, and green stones would have all been shaped into the beads that would be strung intricately on a string, all in all taking a lot of time and effort. The particular collar depicted in the bust looks to me to fit the model of the plant form collar. These designs were one of, if not the only design found at Amarna, which especially included faience and have different pendant forms. Another Egyptologist, Bell's work, shows that these collars appear to have been more commonly worn as part of festivals or ritual events, and also appeared as part of the funerary dress, another way of bringing life to the afterlife. Since, however, plant form pendants show up more commonly in private homes, where not many funerary materials would have been found, it suggests, at least in Amarna, the collars were being used primarily by the living instead of the dead. This plant form collar has been interpreted as a symbol of rebirth and regeneration. Associations with the god Osiris would have evolved prior to the rule of Akhenaten and the change in religion because it does appear to have been fully integrated. According to Boyce, ideas of the rebirth and regeneration appear to have been as important to the worshippers of the Aten as to the followers of the traditional religion. The main pendants used as part of plant form collars depict fruits, flowers, and leaves. Imitating garlands made from real plants, at least for some of these designs, have been interpreted as representations of plants containing narcotic substances, like the mandrake fruit, opium poppy, and lotus flower, which all contain psychoactive drugs, and grapes and dates were used in alcoholic drinks. Since alcohol and drugs were likely consumed during certain festivals, this may reinforce the idea that such collars were intended for festival use. Now to one of the most discussed aspects of the bust, the missing left eye, which we touched on earlier. Both would have been kept in place with beeswax, and the naturally white coloring of the limestone would shine through the quartz crystal. There are many hypotheses as to why the bust may have been missing an eye, and I'll go through several that I could find. Because it may have been a modello and not a real bust, the eye may have simply been left out. For the purposes of making more busts and art pieces, both eyes would look the same, and therefore they would only need one example. This wasn't only something that I learned while at the museum looking off the tour guide script. It was also discussed in several texts by Van der Pierre, Silverman, Wegner, and Wegner. As mentioned, the bust in Berlin is thought to be a modello for official portraits and was used for teaching students how to carve the internal structures of eyes, so perhaps the left iris was not added. Alternatively, Havas suggested that Thutmose had created the eye, but it was later destroyed, or, according to Tildesley, it just fell out in the workshop at some point between antiquity and its uncovering. Or My favorite, probably because it's the most in-depth and overthought. The missing eye may have also been symbolic. One example of what's called the Amarna eye. From the book From the Banks of the Euphrates, Studies in Honor of Alice Louise Slutsky, other than the Fiend's eyes that resemble or match the eye of Horus, likely as a holdover of what's called the Amarna eye, other than the Fiend's eyes that resemble or match the eye of Horus, likely as a holdover of the old religion. Unfortunately, hardly any Amarna eyes have survived, and that may have been due to the religious nature of the eye symbol itself. In these times and into the next generation of upheaval, there were rulers that the later kings would rather forget, or even worse, condemn their souls in the afterlife. One way to do that was to scratch out the hieroglyphic names on statues and writings, basically erasing them from existence. And another was to scratch out their eyes. This was an even stronger argument because the priests and leaders who came back to power after the Amarna period ended were extremely hateful of all the changes that Akhenaten put in place that took their power in the last generation. But while it's a neat idea, there isn't enough concrete evidence to prove. Yet. For concluding sentiments, today's problems and solutions. Is the one in Berlin real or fake? In The Bust of Nefertiti, A Fraud in Egyptology, by Swiss art historian Henry Sterlin, and in the book Missing Link in Archaeology by the Berlin author and historian Adel van Ersthoven, the bust was claimed to be a modern fake. Sterlin had claims that Borchardt himself created the bust to test ancient pigments, and that when the bust was admired by Prince Johann Georg of Saxony, he supposedly pretended it was genuine to avoid offending the prince. According to this idea, Borchardt also argued that the missing left eye of the bust would have been a sign of disrespect in ancient Egypt, which it could easily have been. But since there aren't many scientific records of the bust appearing until around 11 years after its supposed discovery, and while the paint pigments are ancient in technique, the inner limestone core has never been dated because we don't want to break the outer layer. The other kind of conspiracy theory from Arsevin suggests that Borchardt's wife was the model for the bust, and both authors argue that it was not revealed to the public until 1924 because it was a fake. But of course, most, if not all of this, seems like speculation from just two white men, not the most well-rounded academic sources. So, while reading sources for any academic studies, be cautious of where they actually came from. Another theory was that the existing bust was crafted in the 1930s on Hitler's orders and that the original was lost in World War II. But this does not seem to be true at all. Obviously, an embarrassed Diedrich Bildung would have dismissed the claims as a publicity stunt after radiological tests, detailed computer tomography, and material analysis had proved its authenticity. What nailed it is that not only the pigments used on the bust have been mapped to those used by ancient Egyptian artisans, but the 2006 CT scan had discovered the hidden face of Nefertiti and thus, according to Science News, proved that the bust was genuine. Since the bust unveiling in Berlin in 1924, Egyptian authorities have been rightfully demanding its return. However, no matter what the approach or ask, the bust still remains in Berlin to this day. Personally, I hope that changes soon. When asking didn't work, Egypt threatened to ban German excavations in Egypt unless the bust was returned in 1925 and even 4 years later in 1929. Egypt offered to exchange other artifacts for the bust, but Germany continued to decline. Although Germany had previously strongly opposed repatriation, in 1933, Hermann Göring considered returning the bust to King Farouk Forad of Egypt as a political gesture. But Hitler opposed the idea and told the Egyptian government that he would build another Egyptian museum for Nefertiti, just so they could keep it, as if we needed another reason to hate him. Even when Egypt requested the bust to be returned while under American control, the US refused and advised Egypt to take up the matter with the new German authorities. But even up to the 1950s, Egypt tried to initiate negotiations, but there was no response from Germany. In 1989, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak viewed the bust and announced that Nefertiti was the best ambassador for Egypt and should stay in Berlin. Zani Havas and Kurtji Zia continued to fight for the bust to return to Egypt, arguing that it was taken out of Egypt illegally because Egyptian authorities were misled over the acquisition of the bust in 1913 and demanded that Germany should prove that it was exported legally. Several German art experts have attempted to refute all the claims made by Hawass, pointing to the 1924 document discussing the pact between Boschatz and Egyptian authorities. However, in December 2009, Friedrich Seyfried, director of Berlin's Egyptian Museum and Papyrus Collection, presented Egyptians documents regarding the discovery of the bust. In the documents, the bust was listed as a painted plaster bust of a princess, but in his diary, Boschatz clearly refers to it as the head of Nefertiti. This proves that Boschatz wrote this description so that his country could get the statue, Havas said, and these materials confirm Egypt's contention that he did act unethically with an intent to deceive, and therefore that Egypt wouldn't have considered the bust to be a looted artifact based on the protocol included in the documents and signed by the German excavator and the Egyptian Antiquities Service. Really, the only argument that should matter, which Seir makes in support of repatriation, is that archaeological finds have their home in the country of origin and should be preserved in that country. The repatriation issue springs up again and again and again, from 2003 over the body of Nefertiti sculpture, in 2005 when Hawass requested UNESCO to intervene, in 2007 when Hawass threatened to ban the exhibitions of Egyptian artifacts in Germany, along with a worldwide boycott of loans to German museums to initiate what he called a scientific war. For a more detailed timeline, check out the campaign called Nefertiti's Travels, which was launched by Cultural Association Culture Cooperation based in Hamburg, Germany. During the campaign, postcards depicting the bust with the words "Return to Sender" were distributed, and the group wrote an open letter to German Cultural Minister Bernhard Neumann supporting the view that Egypt should be given the bust on loan. In 2009, the bust was moved back to the Neues Museum, and the appropriateness of its position in Berlin was finally questioned. But the director of the museum was quoted as saying that the authority to approve the return of the bust to Egypt lies with the Prussian cultural heritage and the German cultural minister. Even for the 2012 opening of the new Grand Egyptian Museum near Giza, Germany wouldn't even lend the bust to Egypt. German authorities have argued the bust is too fragile to transport and that legal arguments for repatriation were insubstantial. However, according to The Times, Germany might be worried that returning the bust to Egypt, even as a loan, would mean its permanent departure from Germany. Which is fair. So, does it really matter if the Berlin bust is authentically ancient? Well, hell to the yes. For the reality of historical fact, it is important to know that the true bust is being unfairly held by the Berlin Museum. But in the artistic sense, the style, pigments, and materials match what the ancient Egyptians were doing. Basically, if it is a fake, then the historical archaeological artifact is a marvel in ancient art replication and getting material that is much older than the date it was actually made. But what's extremely important, to me at least, is the inspiration that has followed this piece for over a century. The mystery, the magic, the multitude of scientific fields that branch off from each little portion of the bust. The entire thing is simply incredible, and we should never take recorded human history in any form for granted. The last aside, what is extremely important to remember is that she was Nubian. She was black. According to Clegg in 2018, first, ancient Egypt was in Africa. Second, the natives of ancient Egypt referred to their country as Kemet, land of the blacks or the black land. Although this may refer to the black land as in when the Nile floods, the silt turns the land black. In addition to this, the ancient Egyptian language was African, not Indo-European, Semitic, or Afro-Asiatic. The hieroglyphic images and symbols employed by the ancient Egyptians are native African in origin, the royal mummies are generally African, and have high melanin levels that are consistent with black people. The blood type and physical remains of the general population are consistent with other Nile Valley Africans. The culture of the ancient Egyptians, i.e. religion, family structures, social organization, cosmology, etc., is typically African. Moreover, ancient Hebrew, Greek, and Roman eyewitnesses overwhelmingly describe the ancient Egyptians as black people. And that's awesome! That's real! Thank you so much for listening to the 13th episode of Detours in Archaeology. As always, I want to thank followers and subscribers of my podcast and my website, my Patreon, my lone Patreon subscriber. And if anyone wants to follow me on Patreon and get notifications for everything I drop, it is definitely free. And also, when you do join, please do it on an internet browser rather than doing it over an Apple app, just because they're going to get kickbacks for whatever you donate if you donate anything, which I hope you do. I'm glad we could take this detour into archaeology together, telling the story about the bust of Nefertiti. Of course, there is so much more to learn. Check out the post on archaeology.com for all of the beautiful pictures, more information, and all the citations that I used in this episode. The fun fact this week is inspired by a conversation that we were having at work about women having more photoreceptors than men. It reminded me of Z Frank's True Facts video about the mantis shrimp, and I absolutely adore Z Frank. I highly suggest you watch his channel on YouTube. The mantis shrimp have eyes that are considered the most complex in the animal kingdom. They have mobile stalks, so they can move independently of each other and rotate their eyes in 3 dimensions, which allows them to move their eyes in opposite or different directions at the same time. They are compound, similar to insects. They are made up of thousands of ommatidia, which are individual lenses and retinas that sample each small area of the shrimp's field of view. They have hexnocular vision, so each eye has the equivalent of 3 pupils. They have a very complex color system. They have 12 to 16 types of photoreceptor cells compared to the human's 3. They can detect UV light and polarized light, and 6 types of polarization. And they have extremely fast reaction times. And as their eyes feed directly into their nervous system rather than their brain, they have very fast reaction times, which is great for hunting in the water. If you know any true fun facts, please share them with me and I'll relay them to everyone who listens, and you'll get your own shout out. I'll see you soon for another detour into archaeology. Thanks again.